I am not a specialist in contract law. I am a lawyer, though, and I'm going to look a little bit at the controversy around the license that Darrington Press put out for their new Daggerheart RPG. I'm not going to lie, I'm a little nervous today because, this is a controversial issue, and I want to get some balances right. And here's Megan. Ooh, here's Megan. Hi, Megan. She's so calm. So Darrington Press is the publishing company created by the people behind Critical Role, Matt Mercer and the gang. And they have created their own fantasy TTRPG that is in direct competition with Dungeons and Dragons. Daggerheart definitely is like a big name now, particularly with Critical Role's brand behind it. And also, the two leads behind D&D 5th edition have moved on to Darrington Press. And so there's a lot of excitement around it. However, their license for third parties to use the material in Daggerheart to essentially support the game generated some concerns and discussions 3 weeks ago now. And I think most people found out about it through a video by Dungeons and Discourse, and particularly this one. From 3 weeks ago. Critical Role's insane legal controversy gets worse. And we're going to get to the issue of clickbait at some point. I definitely will address that. And she will admit she does clickbait. But that brought up some concerns that were definitely concerning to me. Oh, full disclosure, she is a friend of mine. I know her a couple years now, and she was one of the players in one of my D&D YouTubers Learn Pathfinder 2e series. And I consulted her, asked her a couple questions before today's stream. But basically, there's this video that I'll react to today that largely was a response to that video, where Bob Worldbuilder says that it's not a scandal. She had used the word scandal to describe the license. I overall like Bob Worldbuilder's channel. He seems like a very chill guy. And he agrees with me on a number of things. He's very critical of Wizards of the Coast, but that also gives him more authority among people who are critical of companies and wary of companies, gives him kind of more of an ability to dismiss concerns. And I'm concerned that this video that was released yesterday is too dismissive of the concerns that I had looking at Dungeons and Discourse's video. I'm just a person, people who know my channel know I speak my mind on a number of controversial topics, including politics. I'm wary of people who accuse others of overreacting, of making a big deal out of nothing. I was told I was being hysterical and crazy for calling Elon Musk a fascist 8 months ago, and then later calling Trump fascist, saying, you just call anyone you disagree with fascist. I stand by those statements, and I think more people have understood since why I said those things. Anyway, I'm wary of people who take a kind of an easy road of kind of presenting themselves as like the less emotional one, who's more rational, and kind of leaves people who say important things that need to be said out in the cold. So I'm a little wary of that kind of attitude. Yeah, on the question of whether this is as bad as the OGL scandal, my short answer is no. And Dungeons and Discourse says no in her video.
There are people out there claiming that this license is as bad as the D&D license that was at the heart of the OGL scandal. I don't think that's true. This is not quite as bad as that. For example, Critical Role, they're not demanding that anybody pay them money for daring to make content for Daggerheart. They're not trying to change the details of the license secretly and pressure third parties into agreeing with it.
But people are treating her video like she doesn't say that. At the same time, the new license is objectively more restrictive and worse than the Creative Commons license that Wizards of the Coast is currently putting their SRD out in. This is called the Darrington Press Community Gaming License. There was a big controversy in January of 2023 when Wizards of the Coast, their open gaming license, tried to force an OGL that revoked the OGL. And so there's been a lot of concern since that TTRPG companies give assurance, and that's going to be a word I come back to third-party publishers so that they can build a business model in supporting their game. And so there was a effort initiated by Paizo, which publishes Pathfinder, to create the Orc license, which it publishes under, and also Chaosium, which publishes Call of Cthulhu, publishes not Call of Cthulhu, but its basic role-playing game rules under, and also DC-20, Dungeon Coach. He's publishing his rule set under the Orc license. It's a share-alike license. So if you publish under it, you are kind of contributing your own publication to the ecosystem. So imagine 1970s Dungeons and Dragons before Gary Gygax and TSR started to sick lawyers against people. You know, people were kind of inspired by each other's work. That's kind of the ideal that the orc license is trying to perpetuate, which some companies, rightfully so, may not want to publish under because they don't want to that share-alike provision. They can publish under a different license. Hasbro is publishing under the Creative Commons, one of the specific kind of Creative Commons license that is not share-alike, which does not force downstream publishers to put their content out into the ecosystem, albeit more restrictive in the share-alike sense. It says it's irrevocable and it can't be amended on a whim. I think the next step for me is to go through some of the provisions that raise eyebrows. And I think the context of all of this is the fact that Darrington Press did not have to use this license. They could have done what other companies are doing. They could have gone Creative Commons. They could have gone ORC. Or they could have done the Matt Colville route with Draw Steel. And we'll look at that at some point too. But they chose not to. Section 1.9. So basically, you can use the public game content, so I assume that includes the SRD, in permitted formats only. Virtual tabletops who we agree to use our content can use it. There was, concern about, can you put a character builder online if you're a fan? Can you create an online reference document that is searchable? If I'm not mistaken, I think those are not permitted here. So it's more restrictive than the other licenses that I've mentioned. It says, subject to the terms of this license, and here's the license. Notable here is that it does not have the word irrevocable or perpetual. Those are just not here. These next two are the big ones. Basically, this says that you release Darrington Press from any copyright infringement claims. This paragraph is about if you, a third-party company, publish adaptive content, whether you can sue Darrington Press if they publish something similar to what you published. You waive and release any and all such claims against Darrington Press. On the one hand, this is kind of a standard thing you find is kind of not alarming. And Dungeons and Discourse in her video defends this clause in general, but for a specific phrase, because you generally don't want to publish, let's say you're Darrington Press, publish Daggerheart, and some individual puts out a PDF saying, I want to make a psychic class. If Darrington Press puts out a psychic class, then they could possibly be sued by a tiny publisher, or anyway, it doesn't have to be a tiny publisher, but by another publisher for supposedly violating their rights because you're putting something out similar. You want to protect yourself from claims like that. And there's a way in which contracts are often drawn up to seem pretty draconian. Here's the phrase that caused concern for Dungeons and Discourse. You hereby waive and release any and all claims, demands, or causes of action that you may now have or may in the future have against Darrington Press, except to the extent that Darrington Press has copied such adaptive content in its entirety and without modification. So they're basically defining ahead of time the rules of the game, that you can only sue us if we copy your third-party class entirely and without any changes to it. And this was dramatized in Discourse's video about comparing butt gnomes and rectal gnomes as possible ancestries, possible races. And so this creates a very high bar, and they could, in theory, do quite a bit to adapt your content. On the one hand, we kind of want an open ecosystem, right? Like, that's what I'm thinking right now. Like, that's what the ORC license does. You can share alike. I'm going to have to think, though, that there is going to be scrutiny if Paizo were to copy verbatim or 90% of what some small company produces and just takes it without much change. And there'll be some community policing involved if someone does something that's obviously not cool. But this is one-sided. Yeah, that's the difference. Darrington Press has freedom from your claims, but the other way around is not true. I did see the Roll for Combat stream recently where they discussed this. And Steve Glicker is a friend of mine as well as Mark Seifter, as well as, I would say, Derek, too, who was their frequent guest. They were saying this is making a tempest out of a teacup. They didn't use that language, but they were kind of like, there is an overreaction to this license. And one of the things Steve Glicker says is he's seen hundreds of contracts, and I believe him. He's a business guy. And he said that this clause, this is something you'll see in a million contracts. I'm going to accept that as true. I have not seen hundreds of contracts like Steve Glicker has. But I go back to the point from earlier. We have gone through the OGL experience. And coming out of the experience, we kind of have different expectations within the TTRPG space, don't we? They didn't have to use this language. They could have done what Wizards of the Coast is going by, use a Creative Commons, where you just don't see a release like this. You don't see a release like this in the Orc license, and you don't see one like this in the Draw Steel license either. It's not necessary to have something like this. It's not in the TTRPG space. Also, in case people are just tuning in, I don't think the scandal equals or surpasses the Hasbro scandal. And I think that's a kind of straw man argument, actually. I think that's a straw man. Because they haven't had companies built their entire business model around supporting Daggerheart and then pulled the rug out from under them. And they don't have this clause that was in the draft OGL saying that we can republish your stuff irrevocably. It doesn't have that stuff. However, what is true is that the provisions we're going over are more restrictive than what Hasbro is publishing its SRD under for both 2014 and 2024. That's true. And obviously, Matt Mercer and them, they haven't proven themselves to be, evil overlords. Ownership can change. TSR was run by gamers. Wizards of the Coast kind of had gamers in its leadership at least in the 90s. These provisions kind of don't need to be here. Another point made on the Roll for Combat stream is that people are kind of spoiled by the open gaming license. It definitely is true that the idea that you put out your own rules and other people can copy them and adapt them is extremely permissive, and that no company is obligated to do that. However, I would say that since the OGL crisis, there is an evolved set of expectations, I hope there is, that is more collaborative. Basically, the bottom line is kind of what Discourse says in her video. She wants Daggerheart to be a real competitor to D&D and wants a license that's friendlier to third-party publishers. Okay, next is Section 11, Amendments to the License. Darrington Press may modify or revise the license at any time in its sole discretion by posting the amended license on its website. The modification will become effective after such postings, so immediately, basically. Just to say, this looks bad. If you're a third-party publisher, they can revoke this license at any time. However, on Roll for Combat, they point out that subparagraph 3 makes this less bad. Because it says, I'll summarize it, basically if you publish something previously and then they revise it, you can still publish that previous book you published, let's say it's a book, under the then existing license. You can still publish that. However, what is apparently true is that if you were to revise that book, or whatever that is, or if it's a VTT, if you revise the VTT, which VTTs are under constant revision, it has to be under the new license. If you're publishing a book, it seems like this saves you, but what if you want to update the book? And also, if you want to build a business model around supporting this game, you want to have a business plan years into the future. And this adds a level of risk because you don't know if the terms will change. And how might terms change? Maybe they'll charge a fee or kind of impose terms that kind of force you to not publish under it anymore. Also, if you're developing a product, it's not instantaneous. You need like a year to gather artwork and get writers and editors and proofreaders to do so. And if on day 364 of that year this is revised, you are kind of screwed. And so you have to create a business plan with this in mind. It kind of doesn't give you assurance. And I go back to that. And I'm going to go look at Draw Steel's license to contrast this with. Okay, first of all, their license only applies to their playtest packet. I've got to assume that this is a similar license will exist for their final rules, as long as people hold Darrington Press to account. But here, it says, our license amendments will not be retroactive. If we amend the license, it will only apply to MCDM content that we release after we announce an amendment. So it only applies to stuff that they publish after the amendment. So that already is a difference. If you have a product that you're selling or that's in development at the time MCDM issues a license amendment, you can continue distributing that product plus any updates, modified versions, and derivative works under the terms of the license that was in place prior to the amendment. So you can see the big difference here. So let's say you start a development cycle of 1 or 2 years for a book. This license protects you as long as you can establish that you started work on it under the license that existed at the time he started work on it. But that's not what Darrington Press's license does, and I hope that is clear. Dungeons and Discourse, probably what I should do is just play the minute from her video, which summarizes her attitude. Oh, and I'm going to address the issue of clickbait. Let me talk about clickbait. Dungeons and Discourse has clickbait. And she'll admit she uses clickbait. And to some degree, not to the same extent, you could say I have clickbait. Because that's kind of what you have to do in YouTube. And I'm going to say, just look at my view counts. Hello. What's the average here? Okay, 10,000, 10,000. I got 58,000 for having something that talked about D&D, saying it failed. That got a lot more views. Whereas Dungeons and Discourse gets much bigger view counts. 235,000. Oh my god, there's her mouth screaming. See? It works. Doing these things works. Also, her channel started later than mine, and she has more subscribers than I do now. And also, she said when we checked in today, as a news channel, it's kind of the norm, a YouTube news channel, to exaggerate with your thumbnails. And from my experience, 100,000 views gets you about $500. It could be different for different creators and blah, blah. But if you're depending on YouTube for income, I've had this exchange with her, you get a lot less views if you're not doing that. And that's like your income. So I'm not going to really poo-poo on her for doing thumbnails, as I won't poo-poo on Bob Worldbuilder for having sponsors in his videos, you know? It's like, we gotta make a living. And the real enemy is YouTube. We're the ones who do all the work for YouTube. And Bob Worldbuilder says this in his previous video. He hates the game, not the player. And that's right. I would just go farther than Bob Worldbuilder and say that YouTube exploits creators. And here I am on YouTube saying it. We do all the work, and the percentages that you get are shit. Where you kind of have to smear shit on your face and dance like a clown in order to make a living. YouTube gets the main, because they can, the lion's share of the money here. My main complaint is that you can't, when you look at the archives, you can't really know what a specific video was about. And maybe after the initial first few days, maybe like having things more conducive to YouTube search features by having more specific titles. I like her content. I think she, not everybody likes her style, but I love it. Her sense of humor is kind of like mine. Your mileage may vary. I understand that people don't like her style, but her content is actually usually more balanced than her clickbaity thumbnails are. I don't know how Bob Worldbuilder is going to characterize her video yet. I know how commenters on the internet characterize her video, because one of the things I did to research this was to look at the Reddit Daggerheart, where everyone portrays her as purely rage bait. She just wants to sow controversy, kind of caricaturing her and implying and saying outright sometimes that there's zero value to what her reporting, which I think is, I don't agree with that. People were casting her as like someone who just wants to tear down something, rage only. But this is her view on Daggerheart.
This anti-creator, this anti-fan has come out of a company run by Critical Role. They should know better. But that isn't to say that Critical Role here are trying to screw the community. Remember, Critical Role, Matt Mercer, they're not as big as Hasbro, and TTRPG licensing is super niche. I'm not sure if Darrington Press even have an in-house legal team familiar with the market the way that Hasbro Wizards do. This is Darrington Press's first attempt at a big community license like this, but I do think that it needs another pass. It needs to be amended, because it's actually in the interest of Critical Role to have as many independent creators start making homebrew content, third-party content for Daggerheart in order to rival Dungeons and Dragons. I was actually thinking of making some new content myself, maybe some sort of cum-guttered butt gnome. Now that'd be a good ancestry. Yeah. And by being open, it's the only way that Daggerheart will ever be able to rival Dungeons and Dragons, and that's what I kind of want. And look, people want to make stuff for this game. There's already tons of awesome content and tools out there right now already. It's been really inspiring seeing all the stuff that people have come out with. There's clearly a massive community behind Daggerheart, and I just want more content. And Critical Role, Matt Mercer, obviously, they get that because they just released a new tool for generating cards. So I think their heart is in the right place, but hopefully the terms of this license get reviewed and Critical Role makes some big changes, because right now, people are right to be outraged. Right now, this is a scandal, and we should all be looking at this with a bit of a cautious eye. But I'll be following this as
All right. So I would say that's her thesis statement. She does use the word scandal, but she also is trying to say, we're disappointed and we want you to change this, and this is how it should change. I think to say the sky is falling is not true. To say that creators who criticize this license are saying the sky is falling is not true. To dismiss concerns as making a mountain of a molehill, I disagree with that. And I think it's completely fair to raise these concerns given the OGL crisis and the fact that other companies don't have provisions like this. And why not? Just why not have, something that, hell, Wizards of the Coast is publishing their rules under? I mean, it's not exactly an unattainable standard. So these are fair things to raise, and one should not be, made fun of or come up against attacks on your character because you're doing that. Okay, someone from chat. Yes, I actually do want to hear more if Darrington is addressing these concerns. Darrington talked about the license in their Beacon AMA, seemingly implying that they will update the license when they release their homebrew kit, but nothing specific beyond, quote, we're looking into it. Okay, they kind of have to be vague, I suppose. An acknowledgement, I guess, is good for now. As Discourse's video said, this is not a time to, condemn and pass judgment. This is a time to have a dialogue and critique something in progress. All right, people expressing lack of trust of actors. I think that's true too. I think people change too when they make more money. That's also true. But yeah, honeymoon period. Yeah, my bottom line is why not? Why not address the concerns or do something that other companies who are publishing, like DC20 is publishing under org, or Hasbro's publishing under the Creative Commons. Okay, here is the video. Okay, so debunking Critical Role's new scandal. Now, this is not the thumbnail I saw yesterday. This is the thumbnail I saw yesterday. He said, this is very silly, and in the background, it's implied that there's a thumbnail that says worse than Hasbro, that Darrington Press is worse than Hasbro. Everybody knows this kind of mainly in response to Dungeons and Discourse's video, but Discourse in her video said she did not think this was worse than Hasbro. Okay, she has my position. And so, as someone who's opposed to clickbaity titles, or says he is, Bob Worldbuilder is kind of, that's not necessarily an accurate depiction of what he's opposed to. So, I have to point that out.
What are we doing? Must everything popular be struck down by trolls, dragged through their pits of drama and scandal, then thrust into the outrage mill?
I wonder if Wizards of the Coast published under this license, if he'd have the same attitude. I'll just say that. A lot of this is just kind of, let's give them the benefit of the doubt. And to my answer to that is, this doesn't have to be like this. And these are fair concerns.
It's making me sick to watch as Critical Role's new game, Daggerheart, is being so swiftly torn apart over such a foolish and small piece of its publication.
Torn apart? Yeah, I think that is overstating. I mean, the thumbnail of Dungeons and Discourse's video does make it sound like she's tearing it apart. I will concede that they did something heinous or something really bad's happening. But I'm seeing that being extended to her argument, but I don't think that's what's going on. And that's Megan yelling. So it's kind of, one could say this is rage about rage, too. Rage bait about rage. Rage bait. Oh, he's probably talking about Reddit. Okay. I have not seen, for my research for this video, what I saw was basically Reddit threads. Everything pointed me to the Daggerheart Reddit threads. What I saw was more people saying that people were making a big deal out of nothing. And people are getting downvoted raising concerns. That's what I've seen on Reddit. I hate her video. She's a rage bait channel. See, there you go. That's what I've seen on Reddit.
First, the clickbait scandal claim. Critical Role's game license is as bad or worse than the D&D OGL.
Okay, the gaming license for Daggerheart is as bad, if not worse, than what Wizards proposed changing the OGL to just before they absolutely got dunked on. Yeah, I disagree with that statement. It's not as bad as Wizards' irrevocable, they can change it anytime, they're going to charge fees, they can publish your content. That's an exaggeration. So the comment earlier saying this is about Reddit, yeah, this is from Reddit.
In my other recent video where I briefly highlighted my own apprehensions about this license. It's a little disappointing that Daggerheart didn't learn from D&D's recent license controversy and just use Creative Commons or even follow Shadowdark with a
Okay, all right. I have a less negative impression of this video that I thought I would have. He's agreeing that, yeah, why not use these other licenses other companies are using.
They could have done better, but no one needs to grab a pitchfork here. But if you're going to, at least point it at the few parts of this license that could harm the people using it and the game's community, instead of at one section that is both completely standard and only harmful in a ridiculous, hypothetical situation, because that's the scandalous part, apparently. So in a moment, we'll explain the parts of this license that I think could have been more creator-friendly, but why it's not nearly as bad as what almost happened with the D&D OGL after this brief word from...
Okay, I'm trying to figure out what's going on here. Hopefully we'll get to the specific provisions, but he chose you could call it, let's see if it's a straw man. You guys have seen my criticisms of it. I didn't say it was worse than the draft OGL. It was specific provisions. And then he characterized people raising pitchforks. Okay, we'll just have to get to the provisions and see what he says. But he already kind of has an overall attitude of kind of derision towards people who are raising concerns, and hasn't drawn distinctions among the people who have raised concerns. That some people might say false statements like that was on the screen, while others aren't. It's like that Taking 20 video. And I'm sure where Taking 20 in criticizing Pathfinder 2E would say, but Cody, and kind of like pretend person he's debating against is irrational and like with pitchforks. When you kind of you want to stick to what you're arguing and over and not kind of characterize who you're arguing against. No, Bob did not personally hurt me. Comparing him to Taking 20 feels like a character attack. I apologize. But it is kind of the same. No, I don't take back the fact that saying your opponent is like implying that your opponent's, and again, he's a chill dude and maybe he could do better next time. Maybe he doesn't want to do this, but he's kind of focused on this one comment when I think you're kind of stoking a bit of drama too if you are doing this.
Let's compare it to what I consider to be the gold standards of bespoke TTRPG licenses as established by Shadowdark. 1, the license is in the rulebook. 2, it's one page in plain language. 3, it's clear on what game content to use and how. And 4, it doesn't claim ownership of anything you create with it. So number 1, the Daggerheart license is not in the core rulebook.
I honestly don't know if it's a big deal that it's in the book. People are going to go online because it also might be revised. And there might be like some okay revisions, you know?
So my non-lawyer brain jumps to 4.2 commercial because my Daggerheart videos would be monetized on YouTube, and here's the instructions for audio/video work. On the material, the copyright and attribution must be visible for a time or read in its entirety. Pause there. So in a video about Daggerheart, I'm supposed to show this legal disclaimer on the screen.
That was the Law and Order sound. Yeah, this is kind of BS, yeah.
For a time, as it says here. And if I were running a podcast, I'd have to read this text aloud, which implies that...
That kind of tells me that some lawyer drafted this who doesn't know the hobby that much. That's my first thought when I read that you have to put this language in a video. That's just strange, and also doesn't seem to accomplish much.
And the second sentence says, I must also include certain logos on my video thumbnail.
Daggerheart compatible. I'm a little confused as to why you would say Daggerheart compatible if you're just live streaming a live play. It's not like you're putting out a class.
I think this means that all video and podcast creators can only reference and show materials from the free, non-illustrated Daggerheart SRD, not from the actual core rulebook. Now, I'm not aware of any other TTRPG requiring that level of distinction between official and third-party video and audio content. But it's not a deal breaker for two reasons. One, because I can pretty easily understand and follow those instructions, and two, because I know for a fact that 99% of people making Daggerheart videos and podcasts will not follow those instructions, because
Yeah, that is kind of the reality. I mean, there was a whole scandal, was it last year or the year before? No, last year, where someone got a copyright strike for showing one of the D&D books. And I think the culture, the hobby is such that people are, and I do this in my own Pathfinder videos, I do show images from the pages, but I always make sure it can't substitute for purchasing the PDF. One could say that this is just being put in there as to kind of protect themselves against a particularly excessive use, and that in the real world it's not going to actually be used strictly enforced. But it's also, again, there are other licenses that don't go into this level of detail. So I guess it's cause for concern, but it's also not as concerning as the provisions I highlighted earlier.
they will never read this license. And then Darrington Press is not going to cease and desist hundreds of creators. So these requirements won't be enforced, and therefore they won't be enforceable if Darrington suddenly decided to enforce them.
Again, he's a non-lawyer, but okay, if they're not, then the question's raised, if they're not going to enforce them, why is it being put down, right? Other companies are not putting this language down. I wouldn't dismiss the concern about it, is all I'd say. They want to be able to point to something to have some kind of enforcement action. And it may very well be that in practice, it's for only egregious uses.
So these requirements won't be enforced, and therefore they won't be enforceable if Darrington suddenly decided to enforce them.
Okay, they won't be enforced. That's very likely, at least for the near future. To say it's not enforceable, I disagree with that. I think they might have a legal claim because it's right there in plain language.
Let's talk about writers. If you're hoping to publish written Daggerheart content, these requirements seem even more straightforward. Will all writers do this? Well, right now, the current largest third-party Daggerheart publication, City of the Black Rose on Kickstarter, which looks very cool and made with professional quality, they also do not include the required copyright and attribution in their one-page non-commercial Daggerheart campaign frame sample. And yet, this Kickstarter is being advertised in at least the first 3 episodes of Critical Role's Age of Umbra campaign. So right out of the gate, forget about enforcing the license for hundreds of creators who didn't read it. Critical Role is promoting a product that currently doesn't seem to be following their own license requirements. The Clickbait scandal people completely ignored all of these unusual requirements for video and podcast and these apparent contradictions, and instead, they focused the scandal on something completely hypothetical. That's why I said the only part of this license that I'm apprehensive about is the termination stuff. But when I search my feelings, I know it to be true, that my apprehension stems entirely from what D&D tried to do with the OGL, which was said to be perpetual. So that made the idea of termination seem ugly and manipulative. But really, Daggerheart is clear up front that they can terminate or change the license. So all I'd have to do is just occasionally check for new versions of the license online if I were working on my own Daggerheart book.
Wait, so his issue with the OGL was they lied about it? So he's okay with it being changeable as long as they didn't pretend it was not changeable beforehand?
And maybe I'd have to update my past works to align with new versions of the license, but I'm not clear yet on whether or not that's actually required. And even still, termination is not the main part of this license being contorted by the outrage mill. And we can take a step back. There are 2 parts of this license I've since become aware of that
Wait, is that all he's going to say on amendment and termination before going on to something else? Because I thought that was really cause for concern. So there's a comment. There's no reason Darrington Press needs to be consistent about who they enforce their IP against. If anything, Critical Role having a relationship with the Black Rose seems like a reason to make an expectation. Yeah, you don't really have an argument in court to say, well, I had an expectation they wouldn't enforce this license against me because they allowed another one to go ahead and violate the terms. That's not really how contracts work. The instrument is what controls.
being contorted by the outrage mill.
Okay, being contorted by the outrage mill. Yeah, that's using dismissive language. He just said, oh, I just have to look it up, and maybe I will have to publish under the new terms. But the new terms could be fees. There's nothing limiting them. It said in the license, in its sole discretion. So nothing can limit what they revise it to be. Yeah, again, this is mainly rooted in trust of Matt Mercer and the Critical Role team, it seems like.
There are two parts of this license I've since become aware of that actually seem kind of predatory and like a real hindrance to the game. They are, one, that you must pay Darrington Press's legal fees should a lawsuit arise. That is highly unusual.
This means that you cannot charge Darrington Press for any lawsuits against you. That's kind of standard stuff.
And two, you cannot create any sort of digital tools for Daggerheart. But can you believe it? Even those 2 points are not the scandal.
He's raising fair criticisms of the license. However, his overall tone kind of, we'll see. But I feel he's kind of dismissing people who are raising valid concerns too. Overall, those is the overall effect of his video.
Like I said at the beginning, aiming the pitchfork in the wrong direction. So here we go. The big Daggerheart license scandal that makes it worse than the D&D OGL is that if Darrington Press publishes something that happens to be similar to that Daggerheart Ancestry you published on TTRPG and made $50 on, you can't sue them or claim that they stole your work. Because they didn't steal your work, man. This is the most foolish hypothetical argument that could only come from people who I guess believe that they will design something so amazing that Darrington Press, or in this pipe dream, probably Matt Mercer himself, will find it online and be so stunned by the quality of the design that he copies and pastes it from that silly...
Okay, if that's not going to happen, why do you have the provision in this license? Right? So, I mean, he's saying it's just not going to happen. They're not going to adapt your work. And why do you have to be so specific as to say it has to be a verbatim copy of what you produced in order for you to be able to sue them? Why put that in there? I mean, that's not the salient question. The question is why it's there, and it's because of the possibility, not because of the impossibility of it. Again, I'm not saying Matt Mercer is going to tomorrow copy my butt gnome ancestry. But this is giving themselves some latitude that other companies are not demanding of third-party publishers, and that's just factual.
Peasants PDF, which was probably missing the proper logos and attribution, then sell it himself for millions of dollars that should have been theirs. That ridiculous scenario is being feverishly argued about in comment sections and forums because a handful of creators made it seem like an actual problem.
Handful of creators. Okay, he doesn't name names. I don't know. There were 2 other videos besides Discourse, and I don't know if they were going after this particular provision. But Discourse was specific in her criticism. She said, first of all, you want a provision like this generally so that you can't be constrained because some random person publishes some concept that you want to have your own version of as Darrington Press. But she specifically was going after the language, saying that they cannot be sued in any case unless they specifically take your unaltered work verbatim. That's what she was critical of. Maybe the other videos had a more broader, less precise criticism. I don't know. But he is characterizing all of the criticism as this criticism and saying they have pitchforks and that they are collectively saying this is worse than the OGL. So he's painting the opposition that he's opposed to as a certain irrational mob, and arguably kind of doing a version of what he's accusing them of doing, of creating something to just be angry at. But yeah, that's my fair criticism, Bob. We are... I hope you look at my edited video and see that I think there are some things that are cause for concern in the license as it currently is.
Yeah, this is golden standard number 4. No, the Daggerheart license doesn't claim ownership of anything you create with it or ever require royalties like the OGL tried to do.
That is a factually true statement. It's not worse than the draft OGL, which did claim it could publish your stuff openly. What this less openly does say is that they can publish your stuff so long as it's not verbatim. That's what this does. But he says that's not going to happen. It's not worse, but it's still objectionable.
Any comparison to the OGL controversy is at best a gross misinterpretation. And sure, it can be fun and funny to make a mountain out of a molehill in RPG news. After all, RPGs are supposed to be about fun and games, so satire and hyperbole have a place here. That's the shift I welcomed in my last video about this genre of RPG content. But we all have to be more responsible about making and feeding into what I will call crying wolf scandal content. Because if we turn every molehill into a mountain, then when, not if, but when something worth railing against inevitably happens again to the RPG community, we will all be so callous to the idea of a scandal and so busy arguing amongst ourselves in comment sections over nothing that we will be unable to organize like we did against the OGL changes, and this time we will lose, and the games we love will become less fun because of them. So if you understand...
All right. So his starting point is the concerns are non-concerns. And I don't think he has fully addressed the concerns that I brought up in the first part of the stream. And then from that starting point, he concludes that people are making mountains out of molehills, and then says, because he is skeptical of and has some well-founded criticisms of Wizards of the Coast, a lot of which I agree with, he says that we are hurting the cause because if there are genuine outrages, quote unquote, things to be outraged about, people will not answer the call to action. And I don't know, that's kind of support people who are being accused of making a mountain out of a molehill now in order to protect people's ability in the future. So I don't know. It's kind of having your cake and eating it too kind of argument. You still get to sound like you're against WotC and for the cause, but I don't know. I'm not going to attribute malice at all to him, but I just think he's just not aware of the specific nature of the concerns, and maybe he was just on Reddit too long and seen secondhand characterizations of what these criticisms of the license are. So that's my giving him the benefit of the doubt. But I think back to the main topic, the concerns are legitimate.
And the fact that it is not as fun or easy to be the guy who untangles outrage mill drama, then I hope...
It's not as fun or easy. Oh my God, when you criticize companies that are very popular, it's not easy either. Oh my God, you come under attack, you come under criticism, you get hateful comments. And for him to say it's not enjoyable, that he doesn't get this supposed malicious pleasure that people get in like criticizing, expressing disappointment about a license that doesn't have to have certain provisions, to say that we delight in that fact. Again, I think that's not accurate and kind of turns the world on its head, I think. It's the muckrakers, the people who point out things, particularly when Daggerheart and Matt Mercer are kind of have the love of the community right now, to say that you're, by defending them, taking the unpopular stand, that doesn't sit well with me.
But thank you for watching, keep building, and for God's sake, go play an RPG.
Okay, hopefully we can have a business environment where third-party companies have full assurance that they can support Daggerheart, which we want competitors of D&D to succeed. And that's why concerns were raised by Discourse and by me. Here's Megan, except, you can't really see her, and I just made my camera freeze. I'm sorry. Well, this is strange and awkward to have a frozen image. Okay, I'm reading chat. All said and done, it seems like Darrington is generally listening to the community. So I suspect that this is nowhere near the last revision that we'll see. That's my hope as well. I was worried that if Bob World Builder's video was the last word on this, in terms of what content creators are saying, that would make that less likely. I was hoping to make it more likely by talking today. Megan broke the camera. Megan is too powerful. Yes, she is. Okay, because it's awkward with a still video of me, I'm gonna say thank you for watching. Subscribe if you haven't already. I'm in my casual era. We might want to ring the bell because I might react to things and strike the iron while it's hot. Join my Discord. We have a ranting channel. We talk about germane topics as well as Pathfinder, of course, and also my Patreon, so I can continue doing this. But thank you very much.